Welcome to the We Got It podcast,
an MSU sports podcast for everyone.
We're Jonah and Abby,
a husband and wife who's probably a little bit too obsessed with Spartan sports.
And we want to share a little bit of that obsession and joy with you, from casual fans
to die-hard, bleed green fanatics.
And we hope to make following Michigan State athletics more easy, enjoyable, and engaging for everyone.
So go green.
Go white.
Go
state.
Welcome back to this week's episode of the We Got It podcast, an official podcast of Spartans Illustrated, which is your hub for all things Spartan sports. We're going to hopefully be taking you through a lot of Spartan sports today, focusing primarily on football and men's basketball. So if there is anything else that you are interested in, definitely head over to Spartans Illustrated. They've got some awesome forums that you can have discussions on, talk about articles, check out videos. You can find our podcast hosted there. And so we just are so honored and thankful to continue to be part of this Spartans community through Spartans Illustrated. And, before we get diving into the episode too much more, I'm going to just shamelessly plug ourselves as I do every episode. Our little podcast is growing and we just want to keep reaching more and more Spartan fans with this We Got It mentality of all of us together are engaged in Spartan athletics. The fans are so much of what makes Spartan sports what it is, and we want everyone to feel part of that family. So if you can do your part by liking, subscribing, leaving comments on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever it is, downloading our episodes, subscribing so that when we drop surprise content, which we've done a couple of times, you are the first to be in the know. That seriously means so much to us, and it does so much for our little podcast. So I will stop the plugs now. We are going to dive straight into football because football season is not over. We are headed into kind of the last 3 games of the season coming off of a bye week. And we might be all feeling a little rusty about football. We had a week off. We came off of a bad loss. So let's look forward to our upcoming matchup against the Fighting Illini this Saturday.
Yeah, so MSU travels to Illinois this weekend for their last road game of the season. And it's a pretty big game for the Spartans coming up, like you said, coming off of really 2 tough losses where morale kind of seems to be low. Momentum after that Iowa game seems to kind of be halted. So this is a game where Michigan State can win. I think right now the spread's about 2.5 points. So I think this would, kind of whoever was the home team was probably going to be favored in this one. And Illinois got a decent record. They're 6-3, but I do think that they're probably not quite as good as that record shows. They have lost to some bad teams. And yeah, I just think that they're an opponent that Michigan State can take advantage of. Obviously, I think over the last couple of weeks with the performances that we've seen, nothing's a given, but this is a game that you really like to see the Spartans compete in and kind of get a little bit of confidence back into this team.
Definitely. I think too, so that 2.5 point spread you're saying is probably favoring Illinois because it's going to be at home. Is that a pretty typical point spread for like a home team? Does that make sense? Regardless of if you're in the SEC or the ACC or the Big Ten, you're going to get about 2.5 points for being the home team.
Yeah, I think usually kind of the rule is that the home team gets an extra 2.5 points just by being at home. So so if this game was at a neutral site, it would probably be like a straight pick'em where it was kind of like a 50-50 game. Okay. Nobody is really favored to win.
I was just going to comment, we were talking about in basketball how tough it is to play in the Big Ten. Fan bases travel so well. Their home courts are just insane. The Izzone is a testament to that. Illinois' student section is crazy. There's just so many teams in the Big Ten when it comes to basketball where home court advantage is huge. It's a huge factor. I almost feel like that's kind of the case for the Big Ten too when it comes to football. I think Illinois' fan base is probably going to show up pretty well, especially since they're doing well this season. Do you feel like that's, I don't know, I guess I'm just wondering, should that point spread, and it's betting, so who cares, but should that point spread be a little bit different for like teams who are in the, Pac-12 versus teams that are in the Big Ten? Just
Yeah,
something to think about.
I think too, it's not just the like game environment that is taken into account, but different routine,
Yes.
traveling, different locker room, like having those like
That
unfamiliar
makes sense.
spaces where it just outside of the norm. All right, you're not getting ready in your locker room, you're not having the same exact prep on like game day and the day before than you would on a home game. So I think that also speaks to the game, not necessarily just the atmosphere of the crowd.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
For sure. Because that probably really does have such a bigger difference too in football. Basketball teams travel so much and they're more variable when it comes to their schedule, whereas football is pretty much always played on a Saturday. You've got one game. And so that travel, I think, would really have a big impact on just, how you show up.
Right. Obviously, Michigan State's coming off a bye week this week. Jonathan Smith in his press conference today said they had time to kind of work on some things. I mean, both teams are actually off a bye, so Illinois kind of also has that extra prep.
Okay, I didn't know that
for
they were
this
coming
game.
off a bye week too.
So maybe in a typical situation, maybe that team coming off a bye has a little bit of advantage just to get the extra prep for the game, but Illinois has that same prep as well. There were a couple injuries too in that Indiana game, including Aiden Childs.
Oh dear.
But Jonathan Smith said that he expects Aiden Childs to be able to go on Saturday.
Okay. Do we know what kind of an injury he had?
I think it was something with his shoulder.
Okay.
Or wrist.
Ooh, that's not good.
But I think
I want it to be like a toe.
I think if he's ready to go, then I guess there's probably not a ton of concerns about like how it's going to affect his play and also like long term as well. He did say that Chuck Brantley's still kind of up in the air.
Okay.
If he's going to play or not, which obviously, I mean, I think he's been our best defender throughout the whole entire season. So that would definitely be a big loss for MSU. But one good sign is that Jerron Glover has been practicing the last couple days, which he's been a guy that hasn't really played much the last 4 or 5 games because of injuries. So I think having him back would be good for this offense just to have another weapon on the field.
Provide someone to pass to other than Velling.
And Nick Marsh. Right. But so
there's no problem with Nick Marsh. The problem's when we're throwing to Velling.
I know. We it's a weird coincidence for sure. But I think this week, if we had to play Illinois last week, Childs might not play.
Right.
Brantley probably doesn't play. Glover might not play. So
a godsend.
The bye week came at a good time after kind of getting beat up against Indiana. So it's a positive for Michigan State. Hopefully, like we said earlier, like this is the final stretch of the season. And really all of Michigan State's goals for this year are still ahead of them. And they just still have to execute. I know it's hard after these last
this season.
Several weeks to like, I think have that motivation or same like pep in your step. Going into these games in November, it's cold. It just doesn't seem, maybe for these teams they're going to be playing like the environments that might not be as intense.
Yeah, we're not playing down in Florida. We're playing in Michigan,
right,
and Illinois and Ohio.
So total wild cards.
A little brutal.
You don't know what you're going to see Big Ten November games.
Yes, absolutely.
But this is a game that I don't know. I think Illinois is probably the better team overall, and they've shown that throughout the season. They have a really solid defense. They beat Michigan by 2 scores. So definitely not a team that Michigan State can overlook, but also...
Which we hope isn't saying a lot.
Right, but I guess if you look in comparison to our loss versus them. But this is kind of hopefully a get-right game for Michigan State. We saw how well they came out of the bye week last time against Iowa. It seemed like super prepared, had a great game plan, and played their best game of the season. So I'm really hoping for more of the same.
Definitely. Is there anything else besides, you highlighted Illinois' defense? What else should we be watching for, or should our guys be prepared to face against Illinois on Saturday?
So I was actually saw on Twitter this weekend, or after the Indiana game, I guess, that Michigan State hasn't had a sack. So they haven't sacked an opposing team's quarterback since the Boston College game.
Ugh.
They are bottom 4 in the Power 4 conferences as far as getting to the quarterback, pressuring the quarterback.
Which is pretty different from the first 3-4 games of the season.
Right. I mean, they were getting pressure the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season. They were towards the top of the country when it comes to tackles for loss, getting pressure towards the quarterback. So that's definitely something that's been concerning for the Spartans, is that pass rush. So that's one area that I really hope to see some improvement from the Spartans. I mean, there was guys last year like Jordan Hall, Jalen Thompson, who had some promising signs on the pass rush the end last season, and we haven't really seen much of them at all this season. No, from anybody really since that Boston College game.
Do you feel, I'm not saying that it's not the player's fault, but I'm wondering what element of coaching that plays into it too. I don't feel like there are many times when we are blitzing the other team or throwing everything that we have at their quarterback. Do you feel similar?
Yeah. I mean, Joe Rossi isn't a coordinator who likes to blitz a lot, but even with your 4 linemen, like, you need to be getting more pressure to the quarterback than that.
Absolutely.
And maybe that is something that a wrinkle, maybe through the bye week, that they can add to the defense to add an extra blitzer or have more different looks for the offense, just to kind of try to keep the quarterback on his toes. But you saw, I mean, obviously against Michigan, they gave Warren all the time in the world, made a completely average at best quarterback look competent at times. I mean, same thing with Cade McNamara in Iowa. He had some drives where he was kind of just had all the time in the world and was able to move down the field. I think thankfully with this matchup and with Illinois, is they have been one of the worst teams in the country at protecting their quarterback. Okay. So maybe this is an opportunity.
Might inflate our stats a little bit this week.
But I think it could be a good game for them to kind of get back.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be anything
build up
crazy.
Some of that confidence that, hey, we can actually put pressure on the quarterback and make these sorts of plays against their offense.
Right. And I think you look at the last 5 games, 3 of those games have been against currently top 5 ranked teams.
Jeez. We talked about at the beginning of this podcast, the beginning of this football season, how brutal our schedule was. But then hearing that back, you're like, oh my gosh, our schedule is brutal. And I think there's a lot of disrespect on the Big Ten in football. So often they want to talk about the SEC and the ACC teams, but that is just evidence that Big Ten's got it, man. This is tough competition.
Totally.
And so, like you said, from a third-party perspective, last week's episode, like, MSU really is doing pretty well. Sorry, keep going.
No, you're great. I mean, that's a great point. Like, it has been like an elite level of competition they've had to play over these last 5 weeks. And you look at the other 2 opponents, Iowa and Michigan, 2 teams that are known to have strong offensive lines and protecting their quarterback. So really, like, you couldn't really ask for 5 tougher teams to pressure the quarterback against than the 5 teams that they've played. Thankfully, these last 3 games, speaking specifically to Illinois too, because we were playing them this week, that has an opportunity that maybe that can be more of a factor for this defense. Because especially if guys like Chuck Brantley are out. I mean, obviously Dylan Tatum's been out for the year. We've had some guys in secondary out. Like, the longer you're making those guys play defense, the more likely that offenses are going to be able to expose them. So
that's a good way of putting it.
That's really one thing these last 3 games, especially thinking about, okay, how can we grow going into next year? How can we get some bright spots, some encouraging signs? That's something we need to see, because the pass rush has been non-existent for the last 5 games.
Well, I think that covers Illinois pretty thoroughly. As always, we'll see what happens when the game actually comes, but those are a couple things to kind of look out for if you're a We Got It listener who enjoys looking for some homework to do, you know, paying attention to that pass rush, keeping track of it if we're getting any sacks and all those sorts of things. I think it is kind of a jarring transition from those Lions fans out there of that's something that I think MCDC, Motor City Dan Campbell, does so much is blitz and put pressure on the other quarterback. And we're missing that a little bit now having Hutch out, but it's a stark contrast from Saturday to Sunday if you're a Spartans and a Lions fan. And so hopefully we can bring a little bit of that Lions grit to the pass rush this week.
Absolutely.
So to be completely honest, I don't really have any clue what we're talking about in today's We Got It Covered segment, which maybe is the We Got It Covered segment in its most pure form, which was designed as kind of this, Jonah's got a lot of really awesome sport knowledge, and I'm not saying that I don't either.
It's true.
We're partners and equals in this, but some of us have strengths that the other doesn't. And so in this segment, Jonah usually takes me and all of you lovely listeners and viewers through some confusing point of MSU athletics or just athletics in general, whether it's football, basketball, maybe we'll cover some other stuff at some point too, to just help you feel like you really understand the sport that you're engaging in, that you're enjoying, that you are watching, and so that you feel like you've got it too when it comes to Spartan sports. So today we are talking about the
cylinder rule in basketball.
Okay. A cylinder makes me think of freshman year geometry.
I mean, you're not far off. I mean, the cylinder rule is very much geometrical in nature.
I don't want to do geometry right now.
All right, it's not too difficult. So
Okay.
I think
all right, we're
not jumping into math.
Okay, thank goodness. I have no brain capacity for that.
So basically, the cylinder rule, and this is a newer rule in college basketball. If you see the ref whistle a foul, and usually in basketball, unlike football, they don't really announce those penalties to the TV. They'll go up to the scorer's booth and let them know what the call was and who it's on.
They've got certain hand signals, just like in football, where if you know what signals they're making, you can get a good idea.
Right, but they're not turning on their mic facing the camera like in football. Yeah. So sometimes it can be a little more confusion on if you didn't see what ref called it or whatnot, what's going on. On occasions, you will see the ref whistle for a foul and with their hands kind of make the motion of a cylinder.
Okay.
And the premise of the cylinder call is to protect movement from the offensive player making a basketball play. So a basketball play is essentially shooting the ball. That could be jumping. That could be starting to move the ball, passing the ball. So basically, there is an imaginary cylinder that is around the parameters of the offensive player. So depending on where the defender is, that cylinder would kind of end at the rear of the player. Or to the hips if they're at the side. Or to their extended arms if they're holding the ball.
So like elbows.
So
extended elbows.
Yes.
Okay. You can't have your arms out in a T pose and say, I'm taking up this.
Exactly.
For some of these players, 7 feet on the court because their wingspans are crazy.
So in the effort for the offensive player of making a basketball move, if there is contact within that cylinder, then that is considered a foul. Even if the offensive player is just clearing out space with the ball.
Because they have a right to that space.
Right.
Okay.
And that's been kind of a frustrating point for a lot of coaches because, I think a lot of times it's kind of considered like a ticky-tack foul where a defender's right up in player's grill defending them. And then as soon as they make that basketball move, either going to shoot or to dribble, and they get that contact with the defender, they issue that foul.
Okay. So I have questions about that because there's definitely times where there's contact where fouls aren't called. So for example, you have a defensive player who's posted up underneath the basket or just in front of the basket. And let's say they're set there and then the offensive player goes up to make a layup. They're making a basketball play. And sometimes there is some contact. And most of the time I'm like, don't call a foul. If both players are arriving there at the same time and there's contact, it feels like they're both making basketball plays.
Right.
So it's really interesting as we're diving into this. These seemingly objective rules are so highly subjective when it comes to refereeing.
Right.
Can you describe that a little bit more? Like, when do you feel like it becomes enough contact that in general refs call it? Because, right, I'm not
Yeah.
wrong in that there is sometimes contact and there's no call made. And I'm usually happy about that.
Right. And a couple years ago, I know before the season, the NCAA made a point of emphasis for refs to look out for those fouls, because in a lot of instances, refs weren't calling those fouls when that contact was made within the cylinder.
So that's why we've seen an uptick in so many fouls.
It's definitely a reason. Yeah, I know. And I think a lot of coaches too are frustrated, not just because it's kind of that ticky-tack foul in a lot of cases, but it does increase fouls. It affects the flow of the game, which from a coach's perspective, if you're like Michigan State, you're trying to push the ball, you're trying to get the pace sped up. Anytime there's a foul, it just halts the pace of the game. And I can see why that's frustrating for coaches. I mean, obviously for fans, a lot of times, I mean, we love watching college basketball, but sometimes it can be like downright unwatchable with how many fouls are in the game, where there's just no flow, no rhythm to the game.
I've heard that cited too from a lot of people who enjoy watching the NBA, of they really do feel that college basketball is unwatchable because of the amount of stoppage that happens.
Right. But going back to your original call about why is that maybe sometimes called when there is contact between an offensive player and defensive player, I think the real key when it comes to the cylinder foul is that contact restricting the basketball play.
Okay.
So
it's not that contact isn't allowed, but that person has the right to their space to make the move that they're making.
Right. So thinking about the instance you said where maybe a offensive player has the ball on the block in the post and that defender's right on them.
Yep.
If that defender kind of goes up with the offensive player shooting the ball and isn't restricting them from putting that shot up, that's contact that's not going to be considered a foul, or hopefully shouldn't be considered a foul.
Which makes a lot of sense about the idea of being straight up, because if you're straight up, you're defending, you're as in a way like physically intimidating someone from doing something. But I can see that as your arms come down, now you're restricting their cylinder space.
Right.
So let me ask you this, and maybe you don't know the answer. Does your cylinder stop at the top of your head?
And I looked this up because I knew you were going to ask this question. I was thinking about the intentional grounding question. Like, is there a back boundary to the box?
I'm sorry.
And I was like, oh, is there a top? Obviously, the floor would be the bottom boundary.
Right.
And in the official NCAA rulebook, it says the top boundary is as tall as a player's hands or even jumping. So if they're going up for a dunk, going up for a shot, that's still their space.
Okay, so that's why I was asking you that, because I think that helps me understand even more why the arms can't come down. Because again, you're restricting the space that the player could be potentially moving into. Again, I'm thinking through my previous example of going up for maybe it's a layup or a slam dunk, where you've got maybe a 6-foot player point guard going up against a 7-foot post player. So that makes a lot of sense. It also makes sense how the bottom of the cylinder would be the floor and not just like the bottom of the player's feet, because we talk about all the time with like layups, dunks, whatever, you have to give the player room to land.
Right.
I love this, honestly, because I think especially when it comes to penalties, whether it's in football or it's in basketball, especially for newer fans or people who aren't intimately familiar with the rule book or all the different motions that the ref can make, having these basic principles of like a player's cylinder when they're making a basketball move can't be impinged upon, that helps simplify, I think, so many calls on the court. So you can think back of, okay, why was that call made? Oh, because the player didn't have room to move their body in the way that they ought to for a basketball play. I think that helps just simplify a lot of things for me. Totally. I'm so glad we covered this.
Yeah, I think it's a helpful rule. I mean, for me, I feel like I've watched so many basketball games with people, and you see the announcer say, oh yeah, that was a cylinder foul. And like people are like, what the heck? Like, it just sounds stupid.
People talk about it that way in general. people always talk about it at the next step of, oh, it was, this happened or whatever, but it all goes back to the basic principle that every player has their own cylinder when they're on offense.
Right. And I remember even having played basketball in college, I remember specifically when this rule was really put an emphasis on by the officials, because we had a team meeting with our coach.
Interesting.
And he was saying, hey, the refs are putting emphasis on this cylinder rule this year. And this is
so even outside of
means.
the NCAA.
Right. You didn't have to expose me that.
Sorry.
But yes.
Sorry. Even outside Division I. Sorry, I can go back.
It wasn't intramurals, I promise. One step above intramurals.
So then I've got one last question, maybe to wrap this up, to relate it back to maybe those fans who also like watching NBA. So then why aren't there so many fouls called in the NBA? Are people just better defenders at that level? Is there less emphasis put on those sorts of calls? What do you feel like makes college basketball so ticky-tacky as opposed to NBA professional?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think if you watch an NBA game, like, you can tell that there's just more flow and rhythm to the games, where I think especially that like kind of an incidental contact is oftentimes not called in the NBA. And I think that's really what the goal or the purpose of the cylinder rule is to prevent defenders from impeding those basketball moves and allowing there to be more flow. But it really hasn't happened that way. And because I think it was put on such a high emphasis by the officials that they're just looking at it.
Now we're almost hyper-focused on it.
Because I think that becomes something that is subjective, was that impeding or restricting the basketball play or not?
And that's so hard. I think, it helps me have a little bit more grace for referees to make that in-the-moment decision-making. It can be I can see how that could be very challenging. And I do think, too, it probably comes back to a lot of it of being the skill level of the players. Even on a Big Ten team, an SEC team, an ACC team, you're going to have guys starting who are not top talent. There's just so many more teams. And so you're going to have guys like, I'm not trying to throw him under the bus. I'm just using him as an example because he's a true freshman and we don't know what his defense skills are yet. Like Kurtang, right? Like he comes in, maybe he's not as in control of his body as someone else. We've definitely seen this from Jackson Kohler and Carson Cooper in the past couple of seasons. They are players who are not of the highest skill level. And a lot of times what you lack in skill, you're going to make up for in like physical presence
or effort or kind of being handsy.
Rushing or being handsy, right? Like, I was late to get to the spot. And so now I'm still going to try to get there, but it's too late and you're going to get called for that.
And that's really a lot of instances you'll see this play is either defenders getting too handsy as they're defending their man, or kind of in the post using their hips too much to kind of get into the space of the offensive player to kind of get them off their space. And that's kind of, and a lot of those, when you're getting hands or using your hips, it's because you're already in a bad position. You're trying to make up from it.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I think sometimes, and I think most coaches, like, they want physicality in the game. So when this is emphasized so much, what might seem like to them, their defenders being physical is called as a cylinder foul because it's subtle. And you can kind of see as they kind of put their hip into the player, or they get a little handsy, or especially too, like if you're face guarding a player with the ball and you're not giving them any space, even if you're not touching them.
As soon as they start to make that move, all of a sudden you're in their cylinder.
Right. So I think it's an interesting rule that isn't talked about a lot. I think basketball broadcasts don't do as well of a job kind of breaking down normal foul calls versus in football where it's so technical, where I feel like the broadcast will kind of go into, okay, this is, and they have the rules experts. Basketball, there's so many more fouls in a game where you can't have some guy from New York come in every single time there's a foul and explain why that was called or not. Usually you'll have that only when that we talked about last week, the flagrants.
Yeah. Or you might see it more like in the NCAA tournament or something where we have more resources and there's more people watching, so they dedicate more time and effort to that.
Totally.
I think one last thing I want to say is you were talking about, face-to-face guarding and just thinking back to how much those fouls are related to lack of skill. I think about Cassius Winston and his ability to defend, and he could be right up on people, but he was his timing was impeccable. Like he just knew exactly when to move off them so he wasn't impeding their cylinder but still preventing them from I miss him. Sorry.
And that's the thing, it's a rule to help create more flow and offensive movement in the game.
And if you're truly a good defender, you showing up and defending that space is going to help prevent it.
And that's the thing with college athletes. A lot of college athletes aren't as disciplined as they will be in the future, especially underclassmen or lower levels of college basketball. Like that's when you see that a lot, when those players just aren't as disciplined to make sure that they're crowding the defender but not breaking that cylinder.
I like that a lot. Well, I love this segment. I feel like it's been so helpful for me, and I love when we do this because I think it helps me see, man, if I am someone who has known and loved basketball and watched countless hours of my siblings playing, watching basketball on TV, watching friends play, and I still get, confused about calls like this or can learn something new. It just shows you don't have to know everything to love sports and to be engaged with them. So I hope you feel encouraged by this segment. Maybe you walk away with a little bit more knowledge and understanding. If you guys have any more questions about the cylinder rule, reach out to us. You can find us on social media. You can email us at the wegotit podcast@gmail.com. We would love to talk you through more of that. And we can always do a follow-up on some of these segments too.
And it's more homework. Next time you're watching a college basketball game, look for the ref making that cylinder call. Yes. Most of us have the capability now to kind of rewind a couple seconds, watch the play again.
And it's so nice because you can skip through the commercials. You get caught back up to live.
Pro tip.
Yes.
But was that offensive or basketball play restricted? Maybe there's instances where that should have been a cylinder call, but absolutely. At least probably you can kind of look for, was that basketball play restricted?
Yeah.
Was that cylinder penetrated? And to see if it was a good call or not.
Absolutely. We need to come up with a different word than homework. Homework makes it sound so sad and boring. So that's our assignment this week, is trying to figure out maybe like a fun little way to call our assignments to you all.
Yeah, we're brainstorming for
definitely.
sure.
Next up is going to be our recap of basketball from this last week. So don't turn this podcast off. We've got more excellent basketball content for you.
All right, let's talk some basketball. I mean, MSU Kansas just ended about 15 minutes ago, so we're going to break it down for you. But that was a tough one. That's a tough one to lose, especially in a lot of ways, the way that we played throughout the night.
Yeah, because we played really well.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
I mean, overall, we rebounded well enough. We limited turnovers. We shot...
Not in the first couple of minutes, but the rest of the game we limited turnovers, yes.
But shooting 18 for 21 from the free throw line. Yeah. Not only shot well, but got to the line as well. Really played as well, well enough to win this game in pretty much every factor except...
long-range shooting.
Hitting wide open threes.
Yeah.
Michigan State shot 3 for 24 for the night from three, which...
How is that possible?
Yeah, too, a lot of those shots were wide open, like I said. And
it wasn't like we were taking all these contested, poor timed, poor planned 3-point shots. We were working it around. We were getting guys open, guys who are notoriously good for hitting threes, like Jaden Akins and Frankie Fiddler, and nothing.
Yeah, and that,
2 of our threes are from Jackson Kohler, right?
No, I think I just hit one.
Just one? Okay, still, the kid hit his first 3-point shot against Niagara. What is happening?
I know, and that now Michigan State's shooting on this season 12 for 60 from three.
Oh my goodness.
Which is a whopping 20% from three. And Michigan State in this game didn't even have to be a good 3-point shooting team. They were 6 for 24 shooting 25%. This
Would have been a completely
a
different
different
basketball
game,
game.
and Michigan State might have come out of that with a victory. And it's just tough because I feel like so many times throughout the last 3 or 4 years, it's kind of the same story, the same script, where we can kind of get this moral victory away from the video. But if I'm honest, I'm tired of moral victories.
Yeah.
Like, moral victories don't
It's still
anything.
a loss. Yeah.
It's still a loss. It doesn't get you anything at the end of the day. And even though we played well in a lot of ways, losing this game, you don't leave feeling good about yourself.
Right.
You know, like, you feel pretty disappointed. And it's just like, what do you do? It's not like they weren't getting open looks. It wasn't like they weren't playing good defense. Izzo said at halftime, I've never seen so many wide open shots.
Yes.
In a half. Like, I don't know. It just, that was a tough loss. And
I know what those boys are going to be doing in the gym this week. I mean, it's just, I physically don't understand how that athletic of people who shoot the basketball as much as they do, that have a basketball in their hands as much as they do, how no one can knock down a shot. I mean, there's cold and then there's that.
Yeah, that's a whole kind of different level. Yeah. And I don't know. Like, I feel like a lot of it could be just on nerves in the game. You're maybe rushing your shot a little bit too much. Not like...
But all game, I totally agree. I think one of the TV commentators after that first time out, they had talked with Coach Izzo, and Izzo was saying, man, the guys look so nervous. He was like, I told them, just play basketball. Let's run our game. And you definitely could see a big shift. I saw especially in Zapala. Those first couple minutes he was out there, I was like, does this kid know how to play Division I basketball? It was just a little scary. And then I don't know what Tom said to him in particular, but he really stepped up his game the rest of the, 35 minutes that were left in that game. But man, I don't know how you stay that cold all game. One thing that I do feel like was really an error on our part and something that we are going to have to figure out is when we are driving to the hoop, actually making contact with the glass. So many times these guys were bailing out. We saw that from Fears multiple times. He's got this beautiful drive to the hoop. Yeah, maybe he's going to face a little bit of adversity getting there, but then it was like he just tried to turn away. One of those times he slid and fell out of bounds. That's a turnover. Or we're turning over the ball because you get stuck in this position. Or we're getting 3/4 of the way to the hoop on that drive and then just like lofting it up from a couple feet away and not even trying to get on the glass. And man, that glass is your best friend. I get some shots, you're not in a good position to use it, but man, when you're driving to the hoop, use that glass.
And it seems like they were, like you said, they were leaving a lot of those balls short, almost like anticipating or expecting there to be contact instead of creating that contact. Because when they were getting that contact, the refs were calling fouls. Like I said, Michigan State shot 21 free throws. So, like, use that to your advantage.
Yes.
And create that contact, because when you leave the ball short, it hits the front of the rim, it gets longer rebounds, and it gets Kansas running.
And it opens you up for the block, and Kansas has got some incredible defenders who are absolutely capable of swatting that ball out of the air, which we saw happen tonight. And so that is something that I don't know if that's a little bit of grit that these guys need to figure out, or confidence. You gotta, when you're driving to that hoop, be willing to commit to take that ball all the way there. And then if you see a better option open up, great. But I feel like so often we are driving to the hoop expecting there to be an option to open up. And when it doesn't, they're like, oh, I don't know what to do. And it's like taking the ball to the hoop isn't even in their mind.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's just frustrating because I feel like every time we're in these games, it seems like Michigan State is good enough to win these games.
Yes.
And that's what it goes back to the moral victories. Right. Like, it's not a talent issue. It's not a Michigan State being overmatched or outmatched. Like, I don't
think it's even a coaching issue. Like maybe we've been suspecting in football. This seems like a similar conversation to football lately. It's just the shots were not falling.
Yeah. I mean, maybe turning the page a little bit, but I feel like one thing that I was happy with, and I feel like we got enough out of, is the center position tonight. Obviously, Jackson Kohler came out in the second half and really kept his team in the game with some
good energy, big
shots, some good touch around the rim. Cooper had a good first half. I feel like Zapala overall played well rebounding the ball.
Yes.
I think they probably, between those three bigs, had around like 24 points, which that's what if you can get 24 points and 15, 16 rebounds out of those three guys on a night, like that's what you need from these guys.
Absolutely.
Like, none of them are going to blow up the scoreboard, but if you can get out of combination those three guys that level of performance against a team like Kansas, that's going to help you throughout the season. But I think if Michigan State continues to not be able to hit these threes, they're not going to be able to win these big games. And a lot of these games that are more toss-ups are going to be just that, toss-ups, if they can't hit threes.
And Kansas was shooting poorly too. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, oh, it would have been a way different game for MSU if they had hit a couple more threes, but it also would have been it would have been a blowout if Kansas had hit even a few more of their threes. So really, we were lucky, I feel like, in that first half, really the first 30 minutes of the game, that Kansas seemed to have a lid on their basket as well.
Yeah, I think to credit Kansas, because I feel like it was a part of their game plan, but Jaden Aiken's only getting one field goal made, 2 field goal attempts in the second half. Like, they were talking about it beginning of the broadcast. Like, it's not just known within Michigan State, but outside as well. Like, Michigan State needs Aikens to be the alpha scorer on this team and a guy that they can get buckets from when the offense is struggling. And he just wasn't able to get any looks. And I think part of that is on him and just being aggressive and hunting your shot.
Yes.
But also, when you're not going and your best player isn't getting shots, like, that's when I want to see Izzo out of a timeout, like, design some looks for Aikens to get him going. I feel like he's such a big guy where he gets 1 or 2 shots to fall, and then it's kind of, we mentioned this early in the season, like, he gets going, like, he gets
lights
hot.
out for him, yes.
But if you don't give him those opportunities, he's not going to get you in that game, or he's not going to get in those spots to hit shots if you can't get him any looks.
Absolutely. And exactly like you said, I think a lot of that credit does go to Kansas. Of they knew they had to shut Jaden Aikens down to help limit us, and they did a really good job of that. But I agree, right? We have to expect that when we're going up against big teams, they're going to be targeting our best players and trying to shut them down. And as much as Jace Richardson showed up and balled out tonight, and even, Fears was doing a great job moving the ball around, they're not going to be our big scorers. They're not going to be the senior player that's going to step up and have that confidence to do that. And so I do agree that probably should have reworked things a little bit throughout that game to help get Jaden more looks.
I think this game is a tough one to get guys going, but I think moving forward, as Michigan State kind of goes into a stretch of non-conference games where, similar to the first 2 games, are going to be overmatching opponents, this is the time to really find minutes for Kurtang, Jace Richardson especially, but also a guy that, coming off an injury, I think he's healing up, but redshirt freshman Garrick Normand. I mean, those are 3 of the best shooters on this team. And in Big Ten play, they're going to need minutes from those guys, because there's a lot of lineups on this team where there just isn't a lot of shooting on the team. Like, Fears isn't much of a shooter. Really, out of your guys who are currently playing minutes, it's Aikens, it's Fiddler, and it's Holloman, are guys that you can kind of count on, or hopefully count on to hit threes. And once we get to January, February, like, we're going to need to have more shooters on the court. So I'd really like to see Izzo in these games coming up to find spots for those guys, to get them going, find rotation where you can give them a couple minutes stretch, where that way you can always have that guy, if Aiken's on the bench or Holloman's on the bench, that you can know, okay, this guy can hit threes.
And it puts that threat back on the defense of the other team that we were playing of, hey, we know they're bringing this guy in to shoot the 3. And so even if we haven't been making the 3, if you've been listening in during football season, we've compared, getting the run game going to open up the pass game to, in basketball, shooting the 3 so that you open up the ability to drive and take those mid-range jumpers. Just having that threat of a good 3-point shooter coming in, even if you haven't been making 3s all night, can really help spread that defense out and open up more options.
Absolutely. But yeah, like, I feel like looking at the outlook for this team, like, I don't feel like I'm losing confidence, or like, I don't think this team can't contend and be at the top level of the Big Ten, because I think they have the talent and they have the pieces. It's just, can they make shots? Can they hit shots when they're wide open? Like, are able to step into shots, have time to shoot, because you're not going to beat really anybody moving forward if you're only hitting 3 threes in a game.
Which seems impossible for that to continue. On the one hand, I think it's easy to brush off and be like, that's never going to happen again. But you look at, we're only shooting 20% from 3 for the first 3 games of the season. And so that is something that I think we are going to have to put strategy and work hours in the gym. I will say, I am so far very much not impressed with Frankie Fiddler. He's supposed to come in and be this huge shooter. And man, he was having no better luck than anybody else tonight.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy that Michigan State, especially on nights if Akins isn't getting looks,
Exactly.
like they need him to be able to hit shots, kind of take control in the offense. And it seems like a lot of times he just seems kind of just rushing it a little bit out there. His decision-making seems to be a little delayed where he was kind of giving up some open shots to shoot some contested shots, or when he was going to the rim, didn't know exactly what he was doing with the ball and kind of fumbling the ball. And that's a guy where transferring out of Omaha, averaging 21 points a game. Like, they don't need him to score 21 points a game.
No, but we need you to show up a little bit more than you have.
They need him scoring 12, 14 points a game.
Yes.
Especially on nights when
they're really shutting down Jaden.
Is focusing on Akins and kind of making him a non-factor. Other guys have to step up. And Fiddler, I mean, that's what you brought him in to do.
Yeah, definitely. So I totally agree. I don't think all hope is lost by any way, shape, or form. We just hung with Kansas. The final score made it look like a more, or not final score, but really the last few minutes made it look more rough than it actually was. I mean, we hung with them really well. And, you know, season opening rankings, who know what they'll mean, but I don't think anybody disputes that Kansas is going to do well this season. So on the one hand, like, okay, we should take the moral victory. And I think there's a lot of teams who wouldn't even put themselves in this sort of a position to play a top 5, top 10 team this early in the season. And I love that about Tom Izzo. He's always putting those guys in that situation. And I think, too, it's a good wake-up call. We kind of got to ease into this season with a couple of home opener softball games, a little bit against Monmouth and Niagara. But this, I think, and I hope, will be a good wake-up call, especially for guys like Fiddler and Zapala of this is Big Ten basketball. You got to get your poop in a group and show up and be ready to play basketball, because from the moment that whistle is blown and the ball is tipped, it is intense in the Big Ten.
Right. I mean, flipping to the other side of the ball defensively, obviously Hunter Dickinson had a big night, having 28 points. But really, I think that was kind of the strategy going into the game, is let Dickinson have his and make kind of the other guys not as big of factors. And they did a really good job of that. I mean, especially in that first half, I think they had maybe 1 or 2 field goals that were made outside of Hunter Dickinson. And it allowed Michigan State to stay in this game because they were only letting one guy beat them instead of getting beat by 2, 3, 4 guys. And
I just hate that it has to be Hunter Dickinson that has to be racking.
I know. He just needs to get a job at this point.
Please, just graduate and get out of here.
I know. He's one of those guys. I feel like there's always that guy in college basketball every year where it's like, this guy's been around for 15 years. And he's definitely that guy this year where it just seems like, dude, like, you're not going anywhere. Just get a job.
I'm done. I'm done seeing your face.
Yeah.
Especially all those moving screens. Those are disgusting. Get those out of there. I don't know why the refs weren't calling any single one of those on him tonight. But, man, it just feels like these gigantic players, refs just let them get away with a lot.
Yeah, I mean, kind of a story as old as time, especially with some of these guys who have been around the block a lot, which is frustrating, where it seems like they get a favorable whistle when, especially too,
or no whistle.
There was a couple of times throughout the game where there would be no call on one end of the floor on Dickinson, but then a very similar play would be called on Michigan State on the opposite side.
Absolutely.
And a lot of those possessions where Michigan State had a chance to tie the game or to go take the lead.
Big momentum swing.
And instead, there was a no call or like a frustrating play. And then on the flip side, Kansas is able to get a fast break or, they had that goaltending by Hunter Dickinson where like the ball was clearly in the cylinder. And that instead of having a lead or tied, it's Kansas up by 2 or Kansas up by 4 again. And it just seemed like every time Michigan State made that run, tied the game, got within one position, then we would have those back-to-back offense, defensive plays where it just gets it right back to Kansas.
And not that, those calls should make a difference in the game. It comes down to us not finishing our shots.
Right.
So, I always want to say that, like, sometimes we're going to vent about calls because I think in basketball, there are just so many opportunities for calls to be wrong. And we were kind of even talking about this about like in football, when you're throwing a flag or when there's a penalty, it's a little bit more like complex and serious a lot of times. Whereas in basketball, there's so many places, there's all these opportunities for things to get missed and those sorts of things. And I think it's good sometimes to hash those out, but I think it's also important to recognize like, hey, you have to be able to transcend that and show up and play anyway, because the score is the score and you gotta
right. And I think it makes matters worse when you're not hitting your threes, where it's like also okay, like these little plays aren't going your way either, and it seems like, geez, like can't we have something kind of go in our favor? Because it seemed like every time we had that momentum or tied the game, then there'd be that play that's just frustrating where you have, like you said, you go to the rim but don't actually finish, or call it it sucks. And it's definitely like not a good feeling. We were hoping you guys could wake up with this podcast and we could be celebrating a victory over number 1 Kansas, but I mean, it is what it is, and we move on, and it's early. It's still obviously early November basketball. We got a lot of basketball left.
Not even halfway through November.
There's definitely some things that Michigan State is going to have to improve on. Like they can't continue to shoot this way if they want to really go anywhere this season.
Definitely. So like you said, we're not even halfway through November. We've got a lot of basketball ahead of us. You kind of hinted at it earlier. But what are we facing in our next upcoming games? What should we be aware of?
So we got a couple games coming up on Saturday and then the following Tuesday against teams that Michigan State shouldn't really have problems with. And then we head straight into Maui. I think in a pretty deep field during Feast Week, which is one of my favorite weeks of the year. College hoops, kind of, it's like a March Madness light where there's kind of good hoops all day, every day, Monday through Sunday of that week. You got college football, you got NFL, you got a little bit of everything. So hopefully this game and these upcoming games this weekend and then next week, they can get going a little bit, hit some shots, get some confidence going into Maui tournament where they have, again, some opportunities to beat some top teams. And you'd love to see Michigan State be able to get a victory over one of those good teams kind of going into Big Ten play to really give this team confidence. Like, hey, we can do this. We're right with these teams. There isn't this huge gap, it seems like. And like you said, it's early. Kansas might not be the number 1 team, but also Michigan State held with a really solid and deep, well-coached Kansas team despite not shooting well. So there's definitely opportunity for growth. And I mean, I don't think anybody's thinking the season is lost, but got to execute.
Well, thank you all for tuning into this week's podcast episode. We're so appreciative of you being here. Thanks for sticking with us through the end of football season, the beginning of basketball season. We're not going anywhere. We've got so much basketball left, months and months, and we are pumped about it. We've got lots of football left. Let's cheer hard for our football Spartans this weekend against the Fighting Illini. Let's get that victory. Let's bring it home. Absolutely. And continue to cheer on your Spartans and the men's basketball team as they, hopefully have a little bit of some easier games coming up, hopefully. And you want to take us out?
Go green.
Go white. Go state.